Muy buenos días, bienvenidos a este tercer día de trabajos y reflexión en el segundo Congreso de Patrimonio Cultural y las Nuevas Tecnologías. Este día lo dedicamos a archivos, bibliotecas y todo lo referente a ello, y la conferencia magistral será impartida por Peter Stokes. Él es doctor en English Paleography of the Early 11th Century por la Universidad de Cambridge y profesor titular del Departamento de Humanidades Digitales del King's College de Londres. Desarrolló nuevos métodos de paleografía cuantitativa en base a computadoras y forma parte del proyecto Digital Resource and Database of Paleography, Manuscripts and Diplomatic. Es jefe en edición de Digital Paleography and Book History y director de la revista Digital Medievalist. Me parece importante decir que Peter ha sido un gran apoyo en varios de los proyectos que hemos desarrollado en el instituto, entonces para nosotros es un gran honor tenerlo aquí. Además de esta conferencia magistral, está impartiendo el curso de paleografía digital de manera gratuita en una de las aulas de este museo, lo cual también creo que es relevante mencionar, que es la primera vez que se imparte un curso de este tipo en México y creo que probablemente en Latinoamérica. Entonces, sin más, los dejo con su presentación. Thank you very much, Peter, for being here.
Thank you very much, Ernesto, and thank you to INAH and everybody who's organized this whole conference. And see, there's a huge amount of effort and organization, which we very much appreciate. I apologize also for speaking in English. I hope that you can understand, but if I speak too quickly or too unclearly, do wave or say something to slow me down a bit, because sometimes I do get a bit fast and unclear. So what I'm going to talk about today, I feel a lot of it probably is very obvious, and indeed it may well be to you, I hope not too much. But by talking about some of these issues and maybe raising them explicitly and putting them into context, I feel that I hope we can get some new insights and perhaps some new suggestions about where we should be going when we talk about digitizing the book. Now, to be clear, I'm talking in this case from my own point of view, which is essentially book history. It's taking a historical object and representing it in a digital form. So I'm not going to be talking about digital publishing in the today, born digital and so on. I'm much more interested in is the historical, cultural heritage aspect. From my own point of view, how can we study books more effectively, but also what does it really mean and what are we doing when we talk about digitizing a book and putting it online. Of course, this is a hot topic in many ways. There's a lot going on, of course, a lot of big projects all around the world, digitizing books, digitizing material and making it available. Not just books, of course, and as you all know very well here in these days in this conference, there's a lot of this sort of work going on. And many of the same issues, I think, will transfer very immediately and obviously to some of these other topics as well. But fundamentally, it seems to me what we're trying to do when we're digitizing particularly material cultural heritage is deeply paradoxical and in many ways impossible. We're trying to take a thing, a solid object, something that has all sorts of history and culture and everything surrounding it, and putting it into that on the screen, somehow transforming it into some way to allow us to do various things with it. Now, of course, in a literal sense, that's impossible. We can't literally take this and put it up in a screen or in digital form, whatever we want to do. So that, in many ways, raises perhaps a philosophical question of what we are doing. Certainly, we're taking something of this. It's not entirely impossible to represent this in some way on a screen. If it was, then we wouldn't be here talking about it at all. But I think it can be helpful to think more about which parts of this we can and cannot reproduce, what that means for what we do and how we interact and use these resources, and also what we might want to do next, where we can go from here. Now, it's quite interesting in the literature, particularly in book history and people working on this material, that some people get very worked up and excited about this. On the one hand, criticizing digitization projects for being incomplete and not somehow reproducing the true object. Or conversely, sometimes people who are doing this work tend to be almost triumphalist in the language, saying how we're reproducing entire libraries in digital form. And of course, both of those extremes are not particularly helpful, I think, so coming somewhere in the middle would be a bit more useful. Why people are polarized in that way is another interesting question. But I can certainly say that it's by no means new. If you look back through the history of different technologies, microfilm, photography, photozincography, all these sorts of reproductive technologies, we see the same sorts of concerns, of fears, and of exaggerations, perhaps, turning up again and again. So what I'm suggesting we do is perhaps slow down, step back a bit, and think about, of course we're not reproducing the whole object, but I'm not sure that's a weakness. In fact, in many ways, I think that's a strength. But to take advantage of that and use it properly, I think we need to, again, look at what we're doing in a bit more detail. So I'm going to start with some more theoretical discussion, perhaps, coming from my background, which, again, is a little bit different from some of the other speakers we've heard. And so it'll be interesting, again, to put the two different points of view together. But particularly look at what we mean by verisimilitude and what this reproduction thing is all about. And then round off with some examples of different directions where people are starting to go. And of course, there will only be a small selection of those. There are many, many different projects and interesting things going on, including some here. So to start then, raise the question of what we're doing with computers. I find it quite helpful to think about this from a historical point of view and to look in many ways at what the computer can do easily and how I think that has led us into certain directions as we've been looking at this new technology and how to use it. For instance, until fairly recently, again, I'm simplifying, but until maybe the 90s or so, most of the work with computers and cultural heritage was tending to focus on the text. I think it's fair enough to say. There's been a lot of work, as I'm sure you know, building up textual libraries and archives and analysis and stylistic studies and so on, going right back to the 1940s, if not earlier. And that makes sense. That's something computers are very good at doing, right? Storing numbers and symbols and manipulating text. And that's, in many ways, what they're designed for. And so it makes sense that we were doing that fairly early on. But of course, there are all sorts of assumptions based into that, including what we mean by text and what reproduction actually is. So there is, of course, an assumption in just about everything that we do that there is some sort of equivalence between these sentences here on the screen. And in fact, that's the whole premise of text, right? As we're reproducing text in different contexts, presenting it in different ways, if these didn't mean the same thing in some sense, then we wouldn't be able to communicate at all. And of course, it is that assumption that allows us to reproduce text in any way and to store it digitally and transmit it and so on and so forth. So yes, this is debatable, and we'll come back to that later, but to a large extent, we understand that what is being stored in the computer from the point of view of text, we sort of know what it is, we know how to use it and interpret it to some extent. And I think that's an important point that doesn't necessarily apply in other cases, although again, there are complications here as well. So we can take this text, we can extract some sort of information from it, namely the characters, the linguistic meaning. We can store that and reproduce it very effectively in a computer. And that's great. That's certainly very valuable and powerful. And so I think that's partly why, for a long time, that was the focus of study in digital humanities, at least. Of course, more recently, as computers have become more powerful, storage is better, we can transport information more easily, we have better photographic reproduction and so on. The image is, in some ways, the next thing to come along. Of course, I'm simplifying, but at least in manuscript studies and book history, I think that does seem to be the case. We now have many, many millions of images, of pages of manuscripts, of books. Google Books, of course, the most famous example. but there are many others as well, different libraries and so on, reproducing this material. And of course, that has changed the way at least people working with historical books have worked. There's an increased interest in images, in the layout of the text, to some extent the materiality of the book, although not so much, because now we can access some of this material more easily. But again, there is an assumption here that's operating, that we can take this, what really is sort of an abstract pattern of colours effectively, that we interpret as a reproduction of the object in some sense, the book that we have, and that we can work with it. And of course, again, it is in some ways the same thing, but not entirely. And the not entirely, of course, is very much the catch. So the visual equivalence, though, that we think at least we can do that to some extent. We can reproduce images, we can work with those, and to some extent now the focus is on reproducing the book as a sequence of pages, I think. This, by the way, did change the study, particularly of handwriting, very significantly, this development of new images and availability of them all. So my main field of research, paleography, this came just at the time where people were very concerned about questions of objectivity and scientific approach to the study of manuscripts and history and so forth. And as we're discussing in the workshop, there was a publication, a very influential book back in 2003, where one of the leading professors in the field called explicitly for more quantitative analysis. Because it's very easy then to say, we have all these images, we have all this material, let's now go and throw our computers at them and study them and see where we come out. And that largely is where this subdiscipline of digital paleography came from. So we have our text, and we can reproduce the text in some way. We have some notion of textual equivalence that we can reproduce and store. And we have something very similar visually. We can reproduce, to a certain degree, the visual appearance of an object. Now, the next question, of course, is what about everything else? And how do we store and represent and work with that? What about that materiality? Now, of course, on the face of it, we don't have any obvious way of doing this. There are developments, interesting things going on, but for the most part, in terms of web presentation and so on, it is very much about text and image and not so much about everything else. At least in the literal sense of reproducing something that we can immediately see and recognize. But having said that, there are other ways of reproducing and representing the objects that we're looking at. To talk about that, I want to digress very briefly to raise codicology, which is the study of the document as a physical object, particularly the pages, the bindings, the physical structure, and so forth. And so it sounds like something that's very difficult to reproduce digitally, but in fact, the codicologists were using computers decades before most other people. But their idea of the book and how to reproduce it is something more like this. Of course, this is a traditional, now looking quite old-fashioned database. This particular one began life in the 1960s and has been built on ever since, 50-odd years now. So this, you wouldn't look at this and say this is reproducing a manuscript. You wouldn't consider this digitizing in the traditional sense. But I would suggest that it is a reproduction in some sense, or a representation. But not in the literal sense that we tend to think about, not in the way that we tend to immediately recognize as such. But where I'm going as we work through this is to suggest that other ways of representing and presenting this material might be useful as well. So this is one, this database of Hebrew manuscripts, one that we've been looking at briefly in the workshop. This is a database of the history of the books and how they were stored and transmitted and so on. You get the idea. So of course they don't reproduce the object in quite the same way, but they do reproduce other aspects and other ways of looking at this. Now, if we accept that this is also a reproduction, then of course, it's also incomplete in a different way, but it might help us get away from this idea that digitizing needs to be a complete, perfect, what looks like what we see in front of us, and therefore it might be less misleading perhaps. We might have fewer people complaining that this is not a complete reproduction. So anyway, what are we doing then, and how can we, what should we be looking at? Well, of course, even the text, it's very easy to say these are the same linguistic meaning, but of course they're not the same meaning exactly. They're not the same thing. And what you see here on the screen is not exactly the same thing as what I have on the screen in front of me. Now, yes, we can represent all this. We can encode this as being in bold and in italics and so on and so forth. But as people working in media studies are very aware, there are differences in presentation and so forth. I think it was probably an exaggeration to say that the medium is the message, but certainly the medium is part of the message. And when that medium changes, some of the people in this room are far more expert than me for discussing that topic. But of course it comes into the question here. But again, this is nothing new, this transformation of the material and presenting it in different ways. Even if we're editing a text, if we're taking a manuscript and just taking that text and putting it in a printed form, the editor is intervening very actively and changing and reproducing what's there. Editing, digitization, all of these processes, of course, are very much acts of selection, and that in turn leads into questions about the politics and the power and who's doing what, where, and so forth. And some very obvious examples, if you go and take this particular historical text, you pull an edition off the shelf, it looks something like this. But if you go to the historical archive, it looks much more like that. Again, I'm sure you all have examples like that, where we're taking and we're representing and changing the way that we look at this material. Another example, Kerouac on the Road, well-known book I'm sure you're familiar with. You may not be so familiar with the fact that it was written like that, and in fact, that's what the original text looks like, 30 meters of it all rolled out. Is that meaningful? Well, yes, of course it is. But in the standard edition that most of us read and work with, it's something very different again. So somebody or some group of people have taken this and made their decisions about how they want to present that, and made their decisions about what is important, what isn't, what it should look like and what not. And in exactly the same way, of course, we're doing these things when we present digital materials online, when we digitize books. In fact, so that's just one example. There are many other cases, of course, that we can come up with where reproducing the text really just doesn't capture the original object at all. These are all examples from a publication we put together, but there are many, many others as well. In fact, even the transcription, even in a case like this, apart from the fact that the format is different, there are many cases where even the letters change depending on the point of view of the people who are putting this material together. And this is much less obvious and something that is quite fiercely debated, that is it possible to create a perfect transcription, meaning a perfect copy just of the letters, not of the layout or anything else, and store that and reuse it. For those who say that it is, I present an example that came up in work that I was doing, in fact my first postdoctoral project. We were looking at particular texts written in Old English before the Norman Conquest in 1066. And the goal of the project was to take these manuscripts and copy out exactly what was written in them, just the letters, one after the next, as they appeared in the original. And one of them looks like that, if you copy out what's in the original manuscript. Now, if anybody can read that, I would be amazed. It's no language that I recognize, that's for sure. But that's what this scribe wrote. It's quite clear in the original document. what on earth is going on there? Well, it turns out that this was another manuscript that was written 200 years earlier. And in that time, the shapes of letters changed quite significantly in the writing from this period. So we had someone in the 13th century who apparently was looking at this and was looking at the letters, clearly not understanding it, but copying the letters that were closest in shape to his period and reproducing them in his document. Now, if you go back and if you know the way the letters developed, so here are some examples. This is what the G used to look like, but by the 13th, 14th century, that shape looks much more like an S. In fact, to us today, this looks more like an S, and an F to a P, and so on and so forth. So you can make a table like this, and you can make these sort of substitutions. And if you go through and just purely mechanically substitute this letter for this, and so on, then in fact, you get, but take my word for it, is perfectly accurate 11th century Old English. Now the question is, what did the scribe write? How do I make an objective copy? Do I write this or do I write that? The texts are entirely different depending utterly on my point of view, the political and research questions and so on that I'm bringing to this material. So of course it's an extreme case, but it's just to point out that what we all know in theory but often forget in practice, that all this work that we're doing it's not neutral, it is determined, and it changes very fundamentally in some cases what it is that we're producing and what it is that we're putting online. Even though the digital creates this illusion of being very objective, and there are many very serious scholars who would say that it is possible to perfectly reproduce and neutrally reproduce transcriptions in this way. So how do we convey that digitally is one question that I'm not going to begin to answer here, but at least raise that for discussion. Of course, the same also goes for digital images, something that art historians are very familiar with, but again, other people tend to forget, that the way we reproduce an image is also not at all neutral, but very much determined by all sorts of factors, some technological and some others. So what is this? If you ask a classroom of students, almost always they'll say, this is a manuscript. Well, no, it's not. Of course it's not. It's just as that is not a pipe, right? It's a reproduction, it's an image, it's so on and so forth. But the fact that we think this is a manuscript, that we slip very easily back and forth between the two, is a real problem. And the fact that, at least in English, this painting is called the treachery or treason of images, I think says a lot, that is very treacherous and is something you need to keep in mind. And there are very obvious things, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, we can't smell it, so on and so forth. But there are other things that are much less obvious and that without some sort of training or awareness, we might forget. I'm going to be very unfair to some colleagues who did a project taking images like this, and they measured the size of the letters to a very, very high degree of precision and extrapolated some assumptions, made some arguments about the way that handwriting developed based on these very small changes in the script. What they forgot, of course, is that this is an image, and amongst other things, I'm not sure if you can see from there, there's quite a large curve in the page here, which you can't see from the image back here. And of course that curve is going to change quite significantly the size of the letters if you're measuring them to fractions of a millimeter and so on. And so unfortunately, there are also other issues like the fact that this material expands and contracts in different atmospheric conditions and so on. So although it seems obvious that this is not a manuscript, as I say, it's very easy to be tripped up and to forget that the camera really does lie when you do get these problems. So people like Ségolène Tart and Melissa Terras have been discussing this quite a bit, specifically in the context of digitization, and the fact that this work always encapsulates, either implicitly or explicitly, some interpretation strategy, a quote from them. That's not to mention other issues, of course, colour. I don't know how many of you even know that you need to calibrate your color on the screen to make sure that the colors that you're reproducing are the same as the colors that the photographer took. Every screen is different when it's manufactured. The colors that you see are different. The colors that I see here in front of me are different from the colors up there, and so on and so forth. And that's before we even get into more subtle but perhaps more important issues about what do we select, what do we photograph, and how do we present it? Do we present it in color or not? Who decides which books are digitized, which pages are included, and so on and so forth. These questions and the power relationships they embed are very important, particularly somewhere like here, with all sorts of interesting questions about indigenous mixed cultures, language, and so on and so forth. So they certainly need to be considered in some of these digitization projects. And I'm not sure that the people doing them necessarily keep that in mind. So we have our treacherous images, which we use, those of us working with this material use every day in our work. And again, referring to putting a book online or digitizing a manuscript tends to mean something like this. And again, I don't mean to pick on the British Library. Most libraries are doing similar sorts of things, where in a sense, what they seem to be trying to do is either reproduce the text without the context or trying to imitate the original object by reproducing some aspects of the physical appearance, namely by what the manuscript looks like. In fact, Sengilan Tartas discussed this in some detail, talking about the fact that the purpose of this seems to be almost always a faithful visual representation, where, quoting her, the word faithful refers to physical appearance rather than to meaning or presence. And again, I think that is partly due to technological reasons. And in fact, one of the reasons why they have just a page here is because of the way the photographic setups normally operate, where they tend to take all of one pages at a time and then all of the other pages. But of course, no book ever looks like that. You have at least the opening, the 2 pages, and it's not going to be floating in some sort of black ether and so forth as well. So there are decisions here, there are assumptions that are probably not even considered explicitly, but are very much part of it. But that seems to be the default that perhaps people aren't always thinking about enough. The British Library one, you can go for what they call an open book view, where you see the 2 pages together, but that's what it looks like. Oops, sorry. Where in fact the pages are still represented as separate, and you can zoom the 2 separately and move them independently of each other. So it's reconstructing the book in a sense, but it's also changing quite significantly what it is. Again, this is common. Some now allow you to show the 2 together. Parker on the web, for instance, you can get this view. But even then, it's another whole discussion is how it's presented, what's around it, the questions of mediation and remediation, some of you are familiar with, that turn up very much. And so what you have around it, how it's presented, how it's framed, again, changes our perception and understanding of what we're looking at here. So again, there are largely pragmatic reasons here, which I do understand, and I sympathize with the need to produce a lot of volume, perhaps more than focusing on particular details. But it is complicated and problematic, I think. Now, I'm certainly not the first to say this, as I'm sure you know. Diana Kitchuk has a very interesting discussion of remediation in early English books online, where she observes the tendency for people to say these websites as if I had a key to the library and I could spend all night in there with the books in front of me. Again, that's fairly obvious problems there. Catherine Sutherland also has questioned this sense that providing the artifact for direct examination sort of assumes this fully mimetic space, which again we know isn't necessarily the case. And yet this rhetoric does seem to continue in some way. So again, to most, perhaps everybody here today, this is obvious. So part of the question is to be aware of it. Part of the question also is how to make other people aware of it, how we can train ourselves and others to notice these issues, to think about the surrounding material and not just accept this rhetoric of reproduction. What does reproduction mean? Does it have to be an image, or can it be other databases and structures, or something entirely altogether? Is this really more faithful than one of the databases that I showed you earlier? Faithful to what, I think, would be one question. Faithful to the visual appearance, perhaps, but not faithful to the structure and to the history and other aspects of that. The key point, I think, is that they're both different views, different models, which I'll come back to shortly. Different research serve for different questions, different audiences, and different purposes. But I think also underlying some of the literature and some of the discussion is a slightly problematic notion of what the original is to begin with. And to illustrate that, I'll point to, well, Kitchuk on the one hand and Chauhan on the other. So this Chauhan, she's discussing essentially this question of the digital representation and you can see the fleshing out the object, what she describes as the sensuality of the book. And she complains, particularly in the digital case, that we experience only the transcendent, the partial, and grasp a fragmented, limited understanding of the book's intrinsic aura and its human ghosts. In Kitchuk, a slightly different point of view, but still complains that it's not a complete scholarly tool at one point. Now again, I don't mean to pick on either of these scholars. They're people I certainly respect a lot. But these short passages I do find a little bit complicated. Certainly no study of any sort, digital or otherwise, is complete. So why should we expect anyone to be? But also, what is the original, the intrinsic aura and the human ghosts? Is that ever something that we can really recover and reproduce? If I go to the library and sit there with the book in front of me, yes, there's no question it's a different experience to looking at it online. I'm certainly not suggesting we shouldn't do that. I had the privilege of taking groups of PhD students to places like the British Library, and it is the effect on people to actually have these manuscripts in front of them and be able to hold them is quite extraordinary. But of course, that's an entirely different experience to many other experiences of the book as we go throughout its history. And this suggestion that perhaps we have lost this as the result of the digital, I think is, as I say, doesn't necessarily work so well here. Again, this is nothing new. Just to pick one example from the 1970s, discussion of photographic reproduction as being one of the most dangerous things at all. And this term dangerous tends to come up a lot in these sorts of discussions. I think his key point, though, as he says, the danger is not necessarily in the reproduction per se, but of faith in the notion that the camera doesn't lie. And so this question of education again. Others have discussed this, Kevin Kiernan and Ray Page for one. One particular case where it was the librarian of a collection who was particularly protective and let very few people in, but then complained about people relying on microfilm and showed up examples of where they went wrong. So certainly there are problems, and we need to think about what we're doing here. It's possible to be dangerous, but it's more complicated also. Now, I put this very briefly just to say there is this question of where do we stop then? If we're worried about completeness, there is a temptation to say that we should try to do everything, and in particular that we should try to do things that the technology allow us to do. And so thinking what are our real priorities, what are our intellectual or other considerations, rather than what do we happen to be able to do at the moment, is something that can be useful. And this is part of a much bigger discussion, but just to say adding more content, in fact, isn't necessarily a good thing at all. In fact, in some ways, the virtue in a lot of this work is to strip things back and to get to the core of what it is that we're trying to look at and trying to study. So rather than positing completeness as a goal, perhaps more focusing on what we want and what we're trying to achieve could be helpful. And there, as we've just been discussing at length in the workshop, I think this idea of modeling can be very useful. The idea here, well, it's been demonstrated that as humans we're constantly constructing models of the world, something we do unconsciously all the time, but is very much part of our cognitive processes. And is something that actually they're now working to reproduce in artificial intelligence and robotics and so on. And so in digital humanities, there's a lot of taking that analogy and saying that when we're producing a website, we're in a sense producing a model of some sort of object. But of course, the model is not supposed to be the original. It has a different purpose. It's designed for some other use. Whether it's something because it's cheaper and easier and more accessible, as in the case of this toy here, or whether it's to test the functioning of the motor or the aerodynamics of the car or whatever it is. Willard McCarty has discussed this a lot. So if we want the original, we go to the library and get it, fundamentally. Instead, what we're trying to do is to make something that's infinitely complex more tractable, cutting down the time and cost, making it something that we can work with and study and view in different ways. Essentially removing the distractions and leaving the key aspects that we're really interested in. Now, the best known example you're probably familiar with, of course, is the map. So what do you put on a map and what do you not? That depends very much on what it is that you're trying to do. A real life-size model of Mexico City would be more or less complete, but it would serve no real useful purpose. It would be crazy to try to do that. Instead, of course, what we want is something where we select, we represent what it is that we're trying to achieve, in this case, finding a way to the museum and present that there. Again, how we do that is another discussion, and the issues in reproducing maps and the politics and so on of that are very well understood. So in many ways, when we're digitizing, I would suggest we're doing something closer to this. We're producing a map of some sort, a representation or a model. If I take this map, which of course is a different model of Mexico City, and I try to use that to find the museum, I'm not going to get very far. So the model also, the use depends very much on the model, and recognizing that is very important also. So when we come to our digitization, our digitized manuscripts, and we try to use it for a purpose that doesn't fit the underlying model, then we get in trouble very quickly. So in McCarty's words then, the model is pragmatic, and so the worth must be judged by its fruitfulness, not by its faithfulness to what it's reproducing. The value is making something tractable in allowing us to see things in different ways and to understanding things better and creating new information. So perhaps rather than saying, what can we add, how can we make this more complete, it might even be more useful to think, what can we take away while still being able to convey and create the understanding in the way that we want. Of course, this is nothing new. Again, if we're writing a book or an article or something, we're asking the same questions. But for some reason, in the digital form, there tends to be this temptation to try to reproduce everything, and an expectation of that as well. The projects I've worked on, by far the most common criticism is, why didn't you do something else? And, well, the answer partly is it didn't have time, but partly also because that's not the point, actually, and that wouldn't necessarily have been helpful. So the incompleteness, actually, if it's done properly, I think is a benefit, is an advantage, not a disadvantage. The problem, of course, is when we're not clear about that, when we forget what is being captured, when we forget the fact that these are not neutral, when we forget everything that goes into them and how they're put together. And so partly, again, it's a question, I think, of education and of being clear what we're doing ourselves. So that's an awful lot of theoretical discussion, which, again, probably is very obvious to most, if not all of us, and has been discussed quite a bit. But for me, at least, it's useful to focus that on these particular questions when we're producing these digital projects. And of the ones I've seen at King's, very many of them have forgotten to do this, or at least have not made it clear what the assumptions and models and politics and so on are, and what the implications of that are. So the title was Where Are We Now and Where Are We Going? And I'm certainly not going to predict all the ideas that people are coming up with, including the ideas that are presented here. There are others who are much better at that than I am. But where are we now? Well, most of the time, again, this is certainly not the only option, but the vast majority of digitization projects at the moment do more or less follow this model of taking the image, reproducing it, putting it up online. Again, fair enough, particularly libraries are very restricted in terms of resources and so on. And that probably is the most valuable for the biggest range of people, which of course is their goal. But it does raise the question, what else is there? And so in the last few minutes, I'll run through fairly quickly a sample of projects that I happen to have come across and some different perspectives. And again, I'm sure there are many others. I know there are many others. One for a start is just something like this. This is colleagues of mine at King's, where at least taking the image and the text and putting the two together like this. The discussion around this project I found quite interesting because there are many people who said, why on earth do you bother? Over here, we have this extremely diplomatic transcription with all the crossouts and insertions and so on. And yet here, we have this in fairly modern, fairly clear handwriting that's pretty legible to an awful lot of people. I can tell you the amount of pain and suffering it took to do this was enormous. So why bother? Well, the argument was that this is not reproducing this. What this is doing is recording the scholarly interpretation of this. And that's the value in this. It's not to see the same thing, but it's recording in a formal way what the scholars saw and how they interpreted this image over there. And I thought that was an important point, actually, and that they had quite a different goal. It was much more about this process of interpretation and how to convey that so that people can understand what they're doing and what's going on. So similar ones here, Shelley Goodwin, the same sort of thing. We have the manuscript, the transcription. Here we can switch different writers on and off, Mary and Percy Shelley. So again, this recording of interpretation and then allowing people to go in and analyze different things about who wrote what and so forth. So not a faithful representation, but one that produces different understanding and different information. Codex Mendoza, of course, the one that we're familiar with, that was produced here. Similar sorts of things, but here with a different purpose, a different model, a different understanding of the book. Here, if you haven't seen this, go and have a look at it. You can move this, drag this around and get this sort of live transcription or translation of the material. So again, a different understanding of what the book is and what the purpose and goal, what we're trying to communicate. Here, similar again, but in this case, they're interested in reproducing the authorial practice and the way in which the Proust was writing. And so you can't see this in the static image, but if you go to the website and you click on it, all these boxes appear in sequence according to when he wrote. Or you can change it over and have them all appear according to the sequence in which it should be read. So another presentation of the book. Again, there are theoretical discussions about paratext and presentation and so on, which I'm not going to get into. But once again, a huge amount of time and effort going into recording all this information. Why? Because it gives a lot of scholarly information and interpretation about the authorial process and communicates that in a way that people find very engaging and immediate as they're looking and playing with it. Of course, we can start getting further and further away from the book as a physical object with the visual representation. This is comparing different texts, looking for keywords and putting connections across them. And of course, once you get into visualization of text, then there are many, many, many different projects that I'm certainly not going to get into. Then the other one I'd mentioned that is looking much more at the development is this, where it's looking at the origin of species, in this case as a text rather than as a material object. But this is an animation where the different colors show the different emendations and changes and insertions that Darwin made as he was going through the different iterations. So this vision, this image of what a book is, and of course now we're a long way away from where we were previously. But it's done with a very clear purpose in mind and a very effective one. We have this notion of the origin of species as this fixed text, but of course that's not true at all in practice. And watching this develop on the screen gives a very clear sense of that. That, believe it or not, is an extremely faithful reproduction of a manuscript image, but in this case not with natural light and taking the light from an angle. So what you can do here is drag this around and light it from different positions. And what that shows is all sorts of very fine details about the production. So here, this is the ink where it's burnt into the page a bit. Here you can see there's an erasure. You can see different things about the gold leaf and so on that was put on top. So clearly not a visual reproduction the way that we think of it, but from an information point of view, perhaps even more faithful than some of the ones we've seen before. And extensions of that I don't have here, but there are three-dimensional models also allowing you to see the curvature of the page and interact with it that way as well. My own project, the DigiPower that was mentioned, this is going even further, well, in a different direction from the book and what it is. Here we were very deliberately taking the object and chopping it up, in a sense, into lots of little pieces, and very deliberately presenting it in a way that doesn't represent the original object. Some people got very upset about that and said that we are misrepresenting, to which I would say, well, that's sort of the point, and I'm not sure it's more misrepresenting than any other. Because what this does is gives you, of course, a different view. So here we have all examples of selected examples of the letter A from different manuscripts in different periods. And by doing that and allowing you to see them and compare them, you get a sense of their handwriting in a way that you would never have got just by looking at the page as a whole. Again, people criticize that because they said it's important to get a sense of the page as a whole. And I say, yes, of course it is, but we already have that. This is adding something different that we didn't have before. And so, again, if you're interested in letters with arches, for instance, and you're interested in how different people produced those arches at different times, you can start bringing this up and so on and so forth. So in this case, we're very deliberately changing and disrupting this idea of what the book is and trying to see things in a new way by, in a sense, refusing to show the original in a way that reproduced that visual appearance. Not entirely. You can go from these and get the page, at least, in its context. As you see here, this is reuse of the framework for Hebrew manuscripts. So, yes, the context is available there, and you can go in and see that. Part of the purpose here was much more about exploration and seeing things differently, rather than just saying, here is the book, there you are, go and look at it. Moving very quickly through, this is another one. As far as I know, not a lot was done with this, but I find quite useful. He took images of the entire manuscript, made them transparent, and then overlaid them on top of each other. And so again, very deliberately not representing what we would think of as the object, but again, seeing things in different ways and getting all sorts of interesting information. In this case, we can see how enormously regular the frames are and how they fit, they really overlap perfectly, telling us quite a lot about how this was put together. And of course, if there was a page that didn't fit, then we could immediately home in on that, have a look and see what else is going on there. This is actually quite similar to what was shown yesterday, taking the colours, but in this case, taking the colours not just in one image, but across the whole object. And again, you can see quite clearly different sections where changes in the decoration and colour profile and so on were used, just by doing something very simple and mechanical, representing the book in an entirely different way over here. Again, is it more or less faithful? Well, that's almost a meaningless question, I think. It's a different way of presenting that same information. And finally, this just one trying to look at the bindings there, and in particular, trying to distinguish between what survives in the binding, which is the darker line. It's not so clear here, but the blurred lines are those sections which were reconstructed. So that's a very quick run through, just some ways of seeing things differently, of presenting this material in different ways. And I'm not going to, again, propose where we're going with all this, but some things that can be done, particularly now that we have all this material available and we have all these images. What next is very much a big question that's being asked. So if you can draw some conclusions from that somewhat rambling discussion, I think we do really need to educate people how to evaluate digital resources, which we do that already for print resources. We teach people how to critically read articles and so on, but not yet as much digitally. And conversely, I think we need to look at our own rhetoric and make sure that we are clear what we have done and not feel tempted to try to say we've done everything when we haven't. Of course, there's more to digitising the book than publishing a sequence of photographs, and people who are more creative than me think about what it is really, how best we can represent it, and see where things go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a really fascinating and inspiring talk. No sé si ustedes tengan alguna pregunta o algún comentario para seguir un poco la conversación por unos 10 minutos con Peter.
I'll ask this question in English. Peter, that was wonderful talk, incredibly rich, both in the theoretical framing of the questions and in some of the examples you provided. I'm curious, since the talk itself is framed around the future, to maybe push you outside of the terrain that you so expertly have mapped for us, which is this problem of capturing the richness and the complexity of the experience of physical objects of different kinds into the digital realm, which is, as you know well, there's a lot of really interesting experimental work going on in digital forensics on having to do with how we represent or capture or edit or publish processes of creation that happen entirely on digital platforms. And I'm curious what your own views are, how you would extend this practice that's focused on, issues of codicology and paleography out into a future of natively digital artifacts, I guess. And the second question is a more perverse one, but it's one I happen to be particularly interested in, which is how do we, and it's related to the first, what are your thoughts about the movement from digital print in the contemporary context of natively digital forms of knowledge production? Do you have any ideas precisely about how you would reverse the process, raising the kind of rich critical issues that you were raising about this issue of what a representation is, where one adds or takes away, how one augments or diminishes? I'm curious what that the vector going the other way might look like. What would be a rich print representation of a natively digital artifact?
Yeah. Interesting but difficult questions. And when you perhaps start with the second one, the examples that come immediately to my mind are probably not as interesting as you're hoping for, in the sense that the hybrid publication, I think, has quite a lot of merit and is something that tends to be forgotten a bit. So I think it is fairly clear that the sorts of information we access digitally and the sorts of information we access in print are not the same, and obvious things like extended reading in a print book and so on. So there are some projects, at least by colleagues, where they've used that quite effectively for hybrid publications. So the obvious thing is you have your searchable text online and your print volume that you can sit and read through and so on. There are, even that physicality, I've taken digital images and manuscripts, printed them out and reconstructed the book physically, because just doing that mechanically helps you understand a lot as well. So there are certainly cases where that does apply. That's probably not as imaginative as you were getting at, where it's something that's more fully digital, of course, it becomes harder and harder to reproduce. And again, I think trying to reproduce shouldn't be the point. The point should be thinking about what works better in print and what works better on screen. Again, there are, yes, I'm sure we've all seen cases of people trying to print out databases and so on, and that's not very helpful at all, I think. So I'm not sure that really answers your second question. The first one, can we take these ideas and transfer them to the forensic side? I'm sure we can. I'm not sure off the top of my head exactly how that would work. Some of what they call the critique génétique, the idea of trying to reconstruct the history of producing the text, that certainly can be done, and I think there is quite a bit of dialogue back and forth there. The physical construction, I can't immediately think of ways, but it'd be interesting to think more about how that might happen. Yeah. So it's not really answering either question, but
¿Alguna otra pregunta por ahí? Parece que no, entonces damos paso a las siguientes mesas de trabajo. Thank you very much again, Peter.
thank you.